I've sold flowers outside the Marrowgate gate for 31 years, and I want to tell you something before I tell you anything else. I counted. That's the thing I did. When the street came apart, when the noise took the tops off my ears, and the smoke came rolling up Cardigan Row like a wave that had forgotten which way was up, I stood there behind my barrow and I counted. 1, 2, 3. That's what I do when I'm frightened. My mother did it. Her mother did it. It's not brave and it's not clever. It's just a thing my hands and my mouth do when the rest of me has gone off somewhere else and can't be reached. I counted the railings. I counted the buttons on a coat. I counted a boy's shoes going past me, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then I lost him in the gray and I started again on something else. And the reason I'm telling you this first is because of the number I stopped on. Because when it was all done, when the sirens had come and the bells at St. Averil's had rung the wrong hour out of pure confusion, and somebody had put a blanket on my shoulders that I didn't ask for, I realized I'd been counting one thing the whole time without knowing it. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. That's how long that boy stood there. That's the whole story, really, but you want the rest of it, so sit down. It was the 3rd Tuesday of April, and it was the kind of morning that makes you forgive the whole rest of the year. I want you to understand that. I want you to feel it, because if you don't feel the before, the after is just noise and you've heard noise before. It was cold in the shade and warm in the sun, and you could stand with one shoulder in each and feel like two different people. The plane trees along the row had that new green on them, that green that's almost yellow, that green that only lasts about 9 days and then goes dark and ordinary. Somebody was frying onions somewhere off toward the market. You always smell it before 9. The vans come in at 6, and by 8 the whole street smells like a fairground. My barrow sits where it sat since I was 30 years old, 20 paces from the northeast corner of the Marrowgate railings, in the lee of the wall, where the wind comes off the river and turns and gives up. Tulips that week. Tulips and the last of the narcissus, and a bucket of eucalyptus that nobody buys but everybody smells. The tourists start at 7:30. They come up from the Corvin Underground in 2s and 3s, and by 9 there's a proper crowd along the railings, 3 deep, phones up, waiting for the changing at 11. And there's the guards. Now, I've watched the 9th ceremonial for 31 years. The stonecoats, gray greatcoats, black boots, that stupid tall bearskin that must weigh a stone and a half, and is the single most impractical object ever devised by a committee of men who never had to wear one. And I want to say something that people don't understand about them, because everyone thinks they're statues and everyone's wrong. They're not statues, they're boys. They're boys who are trying very hard not to be boys for 2 hours at a stretch, and if you know how to look, and I do, God help me, I've had 3 decades of practice, you can see the boy underneath. You see it in the little things. The one who shifts his weight every 90 seconds like clockwork. The one whose eyes flick, just flick, when a pretty girl goes by. The one who gets a fly on his nose in August, and you can see his whole soul screaming inside that uniform, while his face does absolutely nothing. I've known dozens of them. I don't know their names, most of them. You're not supposed to talk to them, and they're not supposed to talk to you, and that's the arrangement, and it works. But I know their habits. I know them the way you know a bird by how it lands. And the one at the northeast box that April post 4, closest to me, the one I could see best from behind my barrow, I'd been watching him for about 11 months. He was young. They're all young, but he was young even for them. Not tall. That surprised people. There's a thing where tourists expect them all to be 6'4", and half of them are 5'8" and just carrying themselves like they're not. He had a jaw that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to be, reddish in the sun. A little muscle in his cheek that jumped when he was tired, and by the end of a shift it jumped a lot. And he had a habit. Every guard has one. His was this. About every 20 minutes, without moving his head, he'd let his eyes go all the way left, to the very corner of the socket, and hold it for maybe 2 seconds and then bring them back. Took me weeks to work out what he was doing. He was looking at the pigeons. There's a lead flashing on the roof of the guardhouse where the pigeons sit and squabble all day long, and he was checking on them. That's all. 20 minutes a glance back to the front, like a man checking on a pot he's got on the boil. That's what I knew about him. That was the sum total of my knowledge of Corporal Wen Halloran on the morning of the 3rd Tuesday of April. He liked pigeons. The Americans arrived about 20 past 9. I remember them because the mother bought from me. Big group, a school trip or a church trip, 20-odd of them, all in the same blue windbreaker with something printed on the back. And the mother, she wasn't a mother actually, I think she was one of the teachers, but she had that mother shape to her, that way of counting heads without seeming to. She came over and bought a bunch of tulips. She said, "What do I do with them? I'm on a bus at 4. And I said, "Give them away." And she laughed, and she did. She stood there and handed them out one at a time to her own students, and they took them, and they were embarrassed and pleased in that way that 15-year-olds are. And one boy put his behind his ear, and everyone screamed with laughter. And she looked back at me and rolled her eyes like, "See what I deal with." And I laughed too. Tulip behind his ear. I want you to remember that boy. I'll be coming back to him. 9:30, 9:45. The crowd was thickening. Coach parties. A hen do, 6 women, sashes, one of them already drinking out of a tin, and it wasn't 10 in the morning. A man with a serious camera who I've seen 100 times and have never once spoken to. A father holding a little girl up on his shoulders so she could see over, and the little girl had a bear, and the bear had a hat. The pigeons went up. That's the first thing. I've thought about this a great deal since, and I've said it to a lot of people in a lot of rooms with a lot of tape recorders on the table, and I'll say it to you the same way I said it to them. The pigeons went up. Not the way they do when a bus backfires or a child claps. That's a scatter. That's a puff of birds up and out and back down in 10 seconds. This wasn't that. Every bird on that street went up at once and stayed up, and they went in one direction, and the direction was away from the market. I remember thinking, and I want you to understand how stupid this thought is, how small and domestic and absurd, and how it's the exact thought I had. I remember thinking, somebody's dropped a crate. And then the street opened. I don't know how to describe the sound because it wasn't a sound. A sound is a thing that happens to your ears. This happened to my chest. This happened to my teeth. This came up through the cobbles and through the soles of my shoes and through my knees, and it took my ribs in its hand and it squeezed. And by the time my ears got involved, it was already over and they were just ringing, useless, a high sweet note like a wine glass. The barrow moved. My barrow, which is oak and iron and I can barely shift it on wet stone, jumped about 4 inches to the left like something had shouldered it. And the sky over the market went the wrong color. Not black. That's what you'd think. Not black, gray-white and fast, coming up and out and up, boiling and then leaning over, leaning toward us. And I remember the moment it stopped being a thing over there and became a thing coming here. The dust came first. It came down Cardigan Row like water down a gutter, and it took the sun out. Just took it. And the temperature dropped and the light went orange and everything more than 30 feet away simply stopped existing. I stood behind my barrow. I don't know why. I want to tell you I was brave. I wasn't. I was a 61-year-old woman whose legs had gone and who was holding onto the handle of a flower cart because it was the only thing in the world that was still where she'd left it. And I started counting. Railings. There are 58 railings between the northeast corner and the gate. I know because I counted them that morning, and I've never been able to stop knowing it. Then the screaming started, and that was worse than the bang. The bang was one thing and then it was over. The screaming built. It came out of the dust in pieces. A woman's voice, high, not words. A man shouting one word over and over, and the word was a name. Somebody nearer, coughing, hacking, coughing like they were trying to bring up their own lungs. And then the running. You've never seen a crowd run. I hope you never do. I don't say that for effect. I say it because a crowd running is not a lot of people running. It's one animal, and the animal is stupid and blind and enormous, and it does not care what's underneath it. They came out of the dust and they came at us, at the palace, because the palace is the big solid thing. The palace is the thing you run toward when the world is coming apart, and the palace has a great iron fence around it and the fence is closed. 400 people. 5. I've seen numbers since and they vary. 400 people running full tilt into 58 railings and a locked gate. And I heard the fence take it. I've heard iron ring. Now post 4. Post 4 is a raised sentry box on the inner side of the railings, about 8 feet in from the fence line, and it faces out, and it sits on a stone step about 1.5 feet high, and from where I was, 20 paces up and behind, I could see its side on. And there was Halloran. Gray coat, bearskin, rifle at the shoulder, but in the palm, exactly as it had been at 8 o'clock, and exactly as it had been at 9, and exactly as it had been 3 seconds before the street came apart. And he had not moved. I want to say that again, because I've had people not believe me, and I've had people tell me I misremembered, and I have sat in a wood-paneled room with 3 men in uniform who wanted me to be less certain, and I would not be less certain, and I will not be less certain now. The street opened, and he did not move. The dust came over him and turned him gray, grayer. The coat went the color of the sky, and his face went the color of the coat, and he did not move. The crowd hit the fence 12 feet in front of him, and the fence rang and hands came through the bars, reaching. And a man was screaming into his face from 18 inches away, screaming, "Open it, open it, open the gate, you bastard, open the gate." And he did not move. His eyes were front. His chin was level. The rifle sat in his hand exactly where the drill book says it sits. And I stood there behind my barrow, 61 years old, ears ringing, counting railings, and I looked at that boy, and I felt something I have never felt before or since. I was furious with him. I want to be honest with you, because if I'm not honest, this is just a story, and this isn't a story, this happened. I hated him for about 90 seconds. I stood there and I looked at that motionless gray figure with the dust settling on his shoulders, and I thought, you little fool. You absolute, brainless, drilled hollow little fool. Because there were people dying 12 feet in front of him. Not metaphorically. There was a woman on the ground at the base of the railings with a crowd on top of her, and I could see one of her arms and it was not moving right. There was a child screaming, that particular scream. You know it if you've heard it. The one that isn't fear, the one that's pain, and I could not see where it was coming from, and neither, I thought, could he, and it did not matter because he wasn't looking. His eyes were front. And the thing about the 9th ceremonial, the thing everybody knows and nobody thinks about, is that they carry live rounds and they answer to a chain of command that goes up and up and up and ends in a building with a flag on it. And they do not leave the post. That is the whole of it. That is the first thing they're taught and the last thing they're tested on. The post is not a place you stand. The post is a promise. You do not leave it for weather. You do not leave it for insult. You do not leave it for a woman who faints, or a man who spits, or a boy who dares his mates to touch your rifle, and God knows I have seen all 3. You leave it when you are relieved, or when you are ordered, or when you are dead. And there was no one to relieve him, and no order coming, and he was not dead. So he stood. And I hated him. The dust started to thin around 10 to 10. Not clear, thin. You could see maybe 60 feet. And what 60 feet showed you was worse than the gray had been, because now you could see who was where. There was a man sitting on the curb across the row, with his hands over his ears and blood coming out from under them. There was a woman walking, quite calmly, quite normally, in a straight line across the road with her handbag on her arm, and she was walking directly into the side of a stationary bus. And she hit it, and she stopped, and she turned 4 degrees and started walking again and hit it again. There was a hen party sash on the cobbles with a boot print on it. And there was a boy at the railings with a tulip behind his ear. He was maybe 40 feet from post 4, hard against the bars, pinned there by the crowd behind him. 15, 16 maybe. Blue windbreaker. That tulip, ridiculous, still tucked over his ear where he'd put it to make his friends laugh, and it was still there because the human head is a strange shape and things stick in it. And he was going white. Not pale, white. And his mouth was open and nothing was coming out of it, and his hands were up at his chest, at the bars, and they weren't gripping anymore. They were just there, going up and down slightly with the pressure behind him. That's crush. I didn't know that then. I know it now because I've learned more about it in the last 2 years than any flower seller should ever have to. But even then, even with no words for it, I knew what I was looking at, because every animal knows what a dying thing looks like. He was being pressed to death against a fence, standing up, in front of 400 people, and not one of them could see him because they were all facing the same way he was. And I opened my mouth. And I want you to know what came out because I've been asked, and the truth is not flattering. Nothing came out. I made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the sound you make in a dream when you try to shout and your throat's full of wool. I was 61 and my legs were gone, and I could not get out from behind my own barrow, and I could not make a sound. But Halloran heard something. Or saw something. I don't know. I've asked, and he doesn't know either, and I think that's the truest thing he's ever said about it. Here's what I saw. I saw his eyes go left. All the way left to the corner of the socket, the way they went every 20 minutes for the pigeons. 2 seconds, that little flick of white. And then they came back. And I actually thought, in that ridiculous slow way your mind works when it's broken, he's checking the birds. The birds are gone, son. The birds went first. And then his eyes went left again. And they stayed there. 3 seconds, 4, 5. His head hadn't moved. Not a millimeter. Chin level, bearskin square, and those eyes were hard over in the corner and fixed. And I turned my own head to follow them, and there was the boy at the railings with the tulip and his hands going up and down. And I looked back at Halloran. And God forgive me, I said it out loud. I said, "Go on then." Just like that, not a scream, not a plea, flat like I was talking to a dog that wouldn't come in out of the rain. Go on then. I have replayed the next 4 seconds of my life perhaps 10,000 times. I have replayed them in the witness box. I have replayed them at 3 in the morning to a ceiling. I have replayed them for a very quiet man from the palace who wrote nothing down and looked at his hands the entire time and then thanked me and left. And every time it's the same, and every time it's too fast, and every time I want to slow it down and I can't. His hand came off the rifle. That's the first thing. The right hand off the small of the stock, and it went, this is the part nobody believes, it went up. To the chin strap. He unclipped the bearskin. In the middle of it, with the world on fire and a fence full of dying people 12 feet away, that boy took 1 second, 1 whole second, to unclip his chin strap, and he lifted that thing off his head with both hands like a man taking off a hat in church. And he set it down. On the step, beside him, squared, mind you, front-facing, not dropped, not thrown, set, the way you'd set it in the stores at the end of a shift. And underneath it he had the reddest hair you have ever seen in your life, and it was flat and wet with sweat, and he looked about 12 years old. And then he moved. He came off that step like something shot out of a gun. Rifle still in his left hand. He never let go of it, not once, not in any of it. And I'll come to why that matters. And he went down the inside of the railings at a dead sprint, coat flying, and 40 feet is nothing. 40 feet is 4 seconds, and he covered it in less. And the crowd saw him coming. And that's the thing I still can't explain properly. They saw the gray coat coming along the inside of the fence at a run, and something went through them, some ripple, and I swear on everything I have that the pressure came off that fence for half a second. Not because anyone decided anything. Because 400 frightened animals saw one thing in a uniform moving with purpose, and every single one of them thought, at the bottom of their brains, he knows what to do. He didn't, he was 23 years old. But they thought it, and it bought him half a second. And he got his hands through the bars. He couldn't lift the boy. Of course he couldn't. The boy was pinned by 400 people, and Halloran was on the wrong side of an iron fence with one hand still full of rifle. So he didn't lift him. He got his forearm through the bars, under the boy's armpit, and he braced. That's all. He put his own arm in there as a wedge, his own arm, between a 15-year-old boy's ribs and a fence, with the weight of a running crowd coming down on it. And he set his boots against the base of the railings, and he leaned back and he held. And he started shouting. And what he shouted was not help, and it was not back, and it was not anything I expected. He shouted, "Step left." Over and over, in the voice. You know the voice. The parade voice, the one that comes up out of the boots and cracks off the stone and goes through your skull like a nail. Step left, step left, step left. And I remember standing there thinking he'd gone mad. Left. There was nothing to the left. There was more fence to the left. And then I looked and there wasn't. Because 30 feet along, past the corner of the wall, the fence stops and there's a service alley. And the service alley runs down to Faro Street, and Faro Street was empty. The whole crowd was crushing itself flat against the palace fence, and there was an open street 30 feet away, and not one person in 400 could see it, because you cannot see anything when you are frightened, except the back of the head in front of you. He could see it, because he'd been standing on a 1.5 foot step looking at that street for 11 months. Step left. Nobody moved for perhaps 3 seconds. And then a man moved. One man. A big man in a green jacket, and he did not go left. He turned around and put both arms out and started shoving backward into the crowd, roaring. And I have never found out who he was, and I have looked, believe me, I have looked. And then it went. Like a jam breaking in a river. The crowd came off that fence in a great sucking rush and went left along the wall and round the corner and into Faro Street, and it was ugly, and people fell, and people were trodden on, and it was not orderly and it was not beautiful. But it moved. And the boy with the tulip came off the railings and went down on his knees on the cobbles, and he was breathing. I could hear him breathing from 20 paces, this terrible whooping, tearing sound, the sound of a chest that had forgotten how, and he was alive. And Corporal Wen Halloran was on his knees on the other side of the fence with his forearm still through the bars and his head down, and his red hair stuck to his skull, and he did not get up. I got out from behind the barrow. Don't ask me how. My legs came back the way they'd gone, all at once, without asking me, and I went across that road with my heart going like a bird in a bag. The boy was on his hands and knees. His friends were around him. The teacher, the tulip woman, was on the ground with him, and she had his face in both her hands, and she was saying his name, and his name was Danny. And Halloran was 10 feet away, on the wrong side of the iron, kneeling. And I got to the railings and I got down, 61, on my knees on cobbles, and I felt every year of it, and I looked through the bars at that boy. And I said, "Are you hurt?" And he said, "I have to go back to the post." That's it, that's what he said. He was gray to the eyebrows. There was blood coming out of his sleeve, his own, from the shoulder, where 400 people had ground his arm into an iron bar for 90 seconds, and it had done what arms do. His hand was still around the rifle. His knuckles were white on it. And he looked at me through the fence with these enormous stunned eyes, and he said it again, quite clearly, quite politely, the way you'd say excuse me on a bus. "Ma'am, I have to go back to the post." And he got up, and he walked back down the inside of the railings, walked, not ran, upright, rifle correct 40 feet back to post 4. And he bent down, and he picked up the bearskin, and he put it on, and he clipped the strap, and he stepped up onto that stone step, and he brought the rifle to the shoulder, and he squared his chin, and he looked front. And he stood there. The sirens came at 4 minutes past 10. I know because I asked later and they told me, and I have never forgotten it. The first appliance from Corvin Central turned into the top of the row at 10:04. And the street opened at 9:56. And I stood there in the middle of that road with the dust coming down on me like gray snow, and a boy called Danny coughing his life back into himself, and a woman walking into a bus, and a sash on the cobbles with a boot print on it. And I looked at post 4. And there was Corporal Win Halloran, gray coat, black boots, bearskin square, rifle at the shoulder, eyes front, blood in his sleeve. Standing exactly where the kingdom of Aldren had put him, at exactly the angle the drill book requires, as though nothing whatsoever had occurred. And I want to tell you what I thought, standing there. I thought, they will destroy him for this. Because I'd hated him for 90 seconds for not moving, and now he had moved, and I knew, the way you know the weather, that somewhere in that great pale building behind him, there was a book, and in the book there was a line, and the line said that a man of the 9th ceremonial does not leave his post. He had left it. For 4 minutes and 11 seconds, by the clock on St. Avril's Tower, which I was staring at without knowing I was staring at it, and which I have never been able to stop knowing. He had left it, and he had gone back, and he had stood there bleeding into his own coat sleeve waiting for someone to come and tell him what he was now. And nobody came. Not for 9 hours. That's the part you don't see in the photographs. You've seen the photograph. Everybody's seen the photograph. Serious cameraman, the one I'd never spoken to in 100 visits, took it at 9:58 from 40 feet away, and it went round the world, and you know exactly the one I mean. Red-haired boy, no hat, arm through the railings, mouth open in a shout, and behind him on an empty step, squared and front-facing, a bearskin cap. And what nobody tells you about that photograph is that, when it was taken, the thing it shows was, by the letter of Aldren military law, a court-martial offense. They didn't arrest him, I want to be clear. Nobody clapped him in irons at the gate. They just left him there. 9 hours, on a step, in the dust, with a wound in his shoulder he didn't report, in a coat he wouldn't take off, in front of an emptying street and then a filling street and then a street full of cameras. Because nobody in that entire kingdom, from the sergeant of the guard to the man at the top of the stairs with the crown in a box, knew what to say about him. And the silence that started at 9:56 that morning went on for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of it. And the whole time, the whole country was screaming, and the palace said nothing, and I sold tulips 20 paces from a boy who wasn't allowed to speak. You'll want to know how that ends. So did I. They put a screen up over my pitch on the Thursday. That's the sort of detail nobody wants when you tell this story. Everybody wants the fence and the boy and the hat on the step. Nobody wants the green plastic screen that the city council put across the top of Cardigan Row, 7 feet high, 40 yards of it, so that people couldn't see where the market had been. But that's what the third day was, a screen and a smell. I want to be honest about the smell because I've never said it to anyone. It wasn't horror. It wasn't what you'd think. It was gas and wet brick and drains, and underneath all that it was onions, because the frying vans had gone up with everything else, and the whole street smelled like a burnt breakfast for 9 days. And I stood behind my barrow selling tulips to people who came to look at a green screen. That's what the world does. That's the whole of it. Something unspeakable happens on a Tuesday, and by Thursday there's a screen up, and a woman selling flowers next to it, and you're queuing for a coffee. 11 dead. I'll say it plainly because I've heard it said badly. 11 in the end. 9 in the first 4 seconds in the market, and they never had a thought about it, and I have made my peace with that as far as anyone can. One woman in the crowd at the fence, she was 74 and she went down in the crush and she never got up, and her name was Ottilie Vance, and she had come up on a coach from Sallowbridge to see the changing of the guard. And a fireman on the Friday, in a cellar that came in on him. 11. And 190-odd hurt, and of those, 31 at the railings, and of the 31, one 15-year-old boy with a tulip behind his ear who is currently, as I understand it, studying engineering somewhere in the north and doing badly at it. And I have never been so pleased about anything in my life as I am about that boy's poor marks. The gas main, that's what it was. Nobody bombed us. I want that understood, because for about 6 hours everybody thought somebody had, and I have never in my life felt a city hold its breath the way Corvin held it that afternoon. A gas main, laid in 1911 under a market street, and a contractor's auger, and a plan that had been photocopied so many times over 80 years that the line showing the main had simply gone, faded off the paper. There was an inquiry and there was a report, and there is a man who signed something in 1987 who I hope sleeps better than I do. That's all it was. A faded line on a photocopy. Now, the boy. They took him off the line at 7 in the evening. 9 hours. I have that from a man who was there and I believe him, and it has never been officially denied. 9 hours on that step, in a coat with a torn shoulder, and here's the thing that people don't grasp. They didn't know what else to do with him. Understand the position they were in. That's the only way any of this makes sense. By 11 o'clock that morning the photograph was on every desk in the kingdom. By 2 it was in Vascaria, and the free cities and God knows where else. By 4 there were people laying flowers, my flowers, half of them. I sold out twice, and I sent the boy from the cafe for more laying flowers at post 4, at the base of the step, in a pile that came up to a grown man's knee. And the man they were laying them for was standing on top of the step in his bearskin, at attention, not allowed to look at them. And the law said he'd committed an offense. Section 9. I know it by heart now. I never wanted to. A soldier of the household regiments who quits his post, or absents himself from his post, without having been regularly relieved, or without leave. There's more of it. It goes on. It ends in a way that would take your breath away if you read it in that room, in that building, with a boy's photograph on the front of every newspaper in the kingdom. And it does not. This is the part that broke the country in half. It does not have an exception in it for why. It doesn't say unless he had a good reason. It doesn't say unless a boy was dying. There is no clause. It was written in 1743 by men who were worried about sentries wandering off to drink, and it says what it says, and it had never once in 280 years been tested on a man who quit his post to hold a 15-year-old off an iron railing with his own arm. That's not a story about a wicked law. I want to be fair. It's a story about an old law which is a different thing and in some ways a worse one. They gave him a desk. That's what they did with him for 11 weeks. They didn't charge him and they didn't clear him. They took him off the line and they put him in an office in the barracks at Wenlock Row filing equipment returns, and they told him not to speak to anyone, and he didn't. Not one word, 11 weeks. There were journalists at his mother's door in Ashmere within 30 hours. There was a man offering, I have this from Halloran himself, years later, and he told it flatly, like a weather report, a man offering 40,000 for an exclusive, standing in his mother's kitchen, while she made him a cup of tea because she didn't know how to knot. He said no. Everyone assumed it was money or arrogance or that the army had him gagged. It was none of those. He told me exactly why, and I'll tell you, but not yet. Meanwhile, the country tore itself to pieces about him. You have to understand what it was like. It wasn't a debate, it was a war. Half the kingdom wanted him made a knight. There were petitions. There was a song, an actually quite terrible song, that got to number 4. There was a woman on the television every night for a fortnight, sobbing, saying that boy saved my grandson. And she was lying. Her grandson was in Vascaria at the time. And I know that because her grandson wrote to the paper and said so, and none of it made the slightest difference. And the other half, and this is the half nobody talks about now, because it lost, the other half were absolutely, coldly certain that if the 9th ceremonial could leave the post because a boy was being crushed, then the 9th ceremonial could leave the post, and then what in God's name is the point of them? And here's the thing. They were right. That was the part that took me 2 years to understand, and I'm going to try to give it to you in 2 minutes, so pay attention. There was a Colonel Adeline Rusk, 9th ceremonial, and she was 58, and she was the one who had to make the recommendation, and I met her once at the end of all this, and she is not a warm woman, and I do not think she wishes to be. And she said a thing at the inquiry that got her called every name under the sun, and it was this. She said, "The post is not a place. The post is a promise, and the promise is that we will be there when it is inconvenient. If we may leave it when the reason is good enough, then the promise is not a promise. It is a preference." And there was uproar, and there were headlines, and there was a man on the radio calling for her resignation. And I sat in my flat with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, and I thought, she's right, and I hate that she's right. Because I'd stood there. I'd hated him for 90 seconds for standing still. And what I'd been hatting, if I'm honest, and I've had to be, more than I'd like, was the exact thing that made him worth anything at all. You cannot have a man who will stand there for 4 minutes while people scream at him and spit at him and beg him, and also have a man who will move when it matters, unless the moving costs him something. That's the whole thing, that's the entire thing. If it's free, it's not discipline, it's just a mood. 11 weeks. And the palace said nothing. Not a word. Not a statement, not a briefing. Not one of those little unattributed lines that get slipped to a friendly paper. Nothing. The king of Aldren, who is 71 years old and who says perhaps 400 public words a year and means every one of them, said nothing at all, and the whole kingdom howled at him. They called it cowardice. They called it contempt. There was a cartoon, I remember it, it was cruel and it was clever, of the crown itself, on a cushion, wearing a bearskin with its eyes front. And I thought that too for a while. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about most of it, and I'm going to tell you what was actually happening in that silence, because I know, because I was in it. They sent a man to me in the 6th week. Very quiet, very plain suit. He didn't say who he was, and I didn't ask, and I have never used his name, and I'm not going to start. He came to the barrow at 3:30 on a wet Wednesday, and he bought some eucalyptus, which nobody buys, and he said, "Mrs. Pell, may I ask you about the 3rd Tuesday of April?" And I said, "Everyone does." And he said, "Yes, but I'd like to ask you a different question." And I put down the string and I looked at him. And he said, "When did you know he was going to move?" I have been asked 10,000 questions about that morning. Police, lawyers, 3 men in a wood-paneled room, a woman from a newspaper who cried, a documentary crew who wanted me to stand in the road and point. Nobody had ever asked me that. And I stood there in the rain with a bunch of eucalyptus in my hand, and I found that I knew the answer instantly, and that I'd known it for 6 weeks and never said it out loud. And I said, when his eyes went left the second time. And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because the first time that was habit. He was checking his birds. He checked his birds every 20 minutes for 11 months, and the world had just ended, and he checked them anyway. because that's what a man does when he's terrified. He does the thing he always does. And I said, but the second time was him. That was him deciding to look. And the quiet man wrote nothing down. He just stood there in the rain, holding a bunch of eucalyptus he didn't want, and after a while he said, "Thank you," and he went. And I didn't understand what I'd given him for another 5 weeks. The 11th week. A Friday, the 19th of June, and it was hot and close, and the trees were dark and ordinary again. And at 11 o'clock in the morning, the gates of Marrowgate opened, and the ninth ceremonial came out onto the forecourt for the changing, the way they had every day of the world. And there were maybe 400 people at the railings, and there had been 400 every single day since April, and every single day they had looked at post 4, and every single day post 4 had been manned by a boy who was not Corporal Wen Halloran. And that Friday it wasn't. I saw him come out. I was at my barrow. I'd sold 3 bunches all morning, and my hands were shaking on the string. He came out with the guard in the file in the middle, and this is going to sound stupid, he was thinner. 11 weeks of a desk and no sleep will do that to a boy of 23, and the coat hung on him. And they marched, and they wheeled, and the sergeant called it, and the file split. And he went to post 4. And he stepped up on that stone step where his bearskin had sat squared and front-facing while he held a boy off a fence, and he brought the rifle to the shoulder, and he squared his chin, and he looked front. And nobody moved. 400 people at those railings, and not one of them made a sound, and not one of them raised a phone. I have never in 31 years heard that street so quiet. And at 1 minute past 11, a man came out of the small door in the wall beside the gate. Not a soldier, a palace man, black coat, and he had a single sheet of paper. And he stood at the railings on the inside, and he read it out. And that was the palace breaking its silence. No press conference, no podium, a man in a black coat with one sheet of paper standing on a forecourt reading to whoever happened to be there. I've since learned that was deliberate, and that the king insisted on it, and that people argued with him about it for a week and lost. He wanted it read at the fence. I'm going to give you what it said. Not all of it. Some of it was formalities and some of it was thanks to the fire service and to the 11, and it was right that it was there, but it's not what you're here for. Here's the part that mattered. It said that the Crown had reviewed the conduct of Corporal Wen Halloran of the 9th Ceremonial on the 3rd Tuesday of April. It said that Corporal Halloran had, in the plain meaning of Section 9, quit his post without leave and without being relieved. It said that this was so. It said, and the man in the black coat read this very slowly, and I have wondered ever since whether he was told to or whether he just couldn't help it. The Crown does not find that Corporal Halloran did not break the law. The Crown finds that he did. And I heard 400 people take a breath at once, and it was the most awful sound. And then he read the next part. The Crown further finds that a soldier who has never once been tempted to leave his post has not kept it. He has merely stood in it. Corporal Halloran was tempted. He was tempted for 4 minutes and 11 seconds in full view under the eyes of this house, and he did not yield to it until a child's life was the price of his obedience. And then he paid what was asked, and he went back and he stood. He did not flee. He returned to his post and remained upon it for 9 hours, wounded, unrelieved, and unspoken to, awaiting the judgment of this house. That is the whole of the matter. He broke the law. He did not break the promise. And there was a decision, and it was this. Corporal Wen Halloran was found to have committed the offense. And the Crown exercised its prerogative, and the sentence was that he be returned to duty with the 9th Ceremonial at Post 4, without loss of rank, without honor, without decoration, and without any mark upon his record whatsoever, favorable or unfavorable. Nothing. No medal, no knighthood, no song, no mention. They put him back on the step, and they wrote nothing down. There was uproar, of course. Both halves of the kingdom were furious, and they were furious in opposite directions. And there were columns, and there were phone-ins. And there was a man on the television who said it was a stitch-up, and a woman who said it was a whitewash, and they were both talking about the same 3 paragraphs. And I stood at my barrow, and I watched that boy on the step with his eyes front, and I understood something that took the legs out from under me. They'd given him the only thing that could possibly be given. Because if they'd punished him, then no man of the 9th would ever move again, not for a dying child, not for anything, and the promise would have become a cage. And if they'd decorated him, if they'd hung a medal on that boy, then every guard on every step in Aldrin would have known forever that there was a reward on the other side of leaving the post. And the promise would have become a bet. So they did the hardest thing, which was nothing. They said, "You were right, and it cost you, and it will always have cost you, and that is what right costs, and now go and stand." They gave him back the post. That was the whole of the king's decision. He gave him back the post. I spoke to him once. 6 years later, 6. He came to the barrow. Out of uniform, he'd been out 3 years by then. He'd done his time and gone, they mostly do. And he was 30-odd, and the jaw had finished deciding, and there was gray in the red already, at the sides, which seemed obscene. And he stood there for a bit, and I didn't know him, and then I did. And he bought tulips. And I said, "You don't have to pay for those." And he said, "Yes, I do," and he did. And I have never spent that money, and it is in a jar on my shelf, and it will be there when I'm not. And I asked him the thing I'd been carrying for 6 years, and I asked it badly, and what I said was, "Why did you take the hat off?" Because that's the bit, isn't it? That's the bit that nobody can explain. He had 4 seconds. A boy was dying. And he spent 1 entire second of those 4 unclipping a chin strap and setting a bearskin cap down squarely on a stone step. And he looked at me, and he had those same enormous stunned eyes. He never lost them. He'll have them when he's 80, and he said, "Because I was coming back." That's it. That's the whole thing. And I have never been able to say it any better than he did standing there with tulips in his hand. He set the hat down because a man who throws his hat is not coming back. A man who throws his hat has gone. And he wasn't going. He was leaving the post for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and he intended, with every fiber of him, in the middle of the worst thing he would ever see, to return to it. And he wanted the hat to be there, squared, front-facing, where it belonged, waiting for him. He never left. He only stepped away. I sell flowers. I'm 67 now, and I'll go on selling them until my back gives out. 20 paces from the northeast corner, in the lee of the wall where the wind comes off the river and gives up. And the boys still come and stand on the step, and they're still boys, and they still shift their weight and flick their eyes and suffer flies in August. And the pigeons came back inside a month because pigeons don't know anything, and God bless them for it. And every single one of those boys, from the day they arrive, knows about Post 4. They know without being told, because nobody tells them, because it's not written down anywhere. It's not in a book. It's not on a plaque. There's nothing there at all. There's just a stone step with a worn place on it, at the corner, where something square used to be set down. And they stand there, 2 hours at a stretch, eyes front. And I look at them across the road, over the tulips, and I think the same thing every time, and it's the only thing I've ever really learned in 36 years of standing in one place. Anyone can hold a line when nothing's coming. The whole of a man is what he does in the 4 minutes and 11 seconds after he sets his hat down.